thought it sounded a bit like when you got your, radical student children home for the holidays, when you start talking like that over breakfast. And I thought that was, I'm not sure that I thought that was hugely his most sensible start.
But now it's time for the Sunday papers, and joining me this week are Andy Bell, the political editor of Channel 5 News.
Hi, Adam.
And Anne McElvoy, the executive editor of Politico and co-host of the Politics at Sam and Anne's podcast. Good morning to you both. Hello, Anne.
Hi, morning, Adam.
Right, OK. I don't think we've got much alternative. We'll have to start with talking about Andy Burnham. And what do you reckon to what seems to be a firm plan to put failing Thames Water into special administration?
Yeah, and I think that is just the beginning, Adam, of what is likely to be quite a dramatic overhaul of utilities. Specifically, I think they're focused on water, where they know there's a lot of customer dissatisfaction with many water companies, not all, but a couple are sort of doing just about okay. But there is certainly, I think, a feeling that they want to look at models. Now, the question then is, Thames Water, I think, is an interesting one because we know it's not working out. It's going to run out of money by the end of the year. There's a kind of plan for creditors could either take over the company directly, but I don't think that is what the government wants. But then you have the big question of what is it then that you want to do, because you've still got all the same issues, that you've got poor infrastructure. The customers' bills have been the big driving sort of concern of governments, but that doesn't answer the question. If you can keep bills down by a kind of edict, but then you still have to invest in the water infrastructure. So the story that I'm hearing is they want to go a lot more towards a kind of mutualisation model for water companies, really quite a sweeping one, across the pitch, and that this will, I think, be quite complex. There'll be a lot of pushback about how it's going to work, and basically you've still got to raise the money if you want to improve water supply and water infrastructure across the country.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question. It's obviously there's, I'm sure, quite a lot of sympathy for the idea that the private sector has failed when it comes to Thames Water, but if they're no longer involved, the only people putting in money into this, presumably in some form, is going to be the taxpayer. And so where are you going to find that extra money? But I was at the event on Friday at the TUC when Andy Burnham made his pitch to the people there. And it was very noticeable how much it was a kind of Labour Party, a pitch to traditional Labour values. I know what I am. I'm the Labour man. I'm afraid I'm old enough to remember the kind of Gordon Brown speech where he said, best when we are Labour at one Labour Party conference, which was a deliberate kind of signal to, I suppose, at that stage, the Blairites, the direction that he wanted to go in. And this seemed to me exactly the same. And this whole pitch about public ownership, public control, which is a little bit, that's not quite so clear when you're talking about public control, but public ownership, public control, this is clearly meant to be one of the founding principles of Burnhamism, I guess, if we can call it that yet.
Well, I mean, I can see the logic of wanting to push the pendulum back, if you like, away from what he calls neoliberalism. But that story about Thames Water is on the front of the Sunday Times. But the Sunday Telegraph has some interesting stuff, including the constitutional expert Adam Boulton saying, do you really want to go back to the pre-Thatcher 1970s when we had, the winter of discontent, union strikes, bailouts by the IMF? Is that where we're heading, Andy?
Well, I'm sure Andy Burnham and his team would deny that, but I think there's no doubting that he is trying to set up the idea that this kind of, as he's called it, 40 years of neoliberalism has not served too much of the country. Too many regions of the country have missed out on what has been wealth creation elsewhere, and therefore you have to get back to the idea of public control, public ownership of some parts of it. He used that phrase. He said the right talked about take back control, and he said that they're the ones who gave it away in the first place, and he's referring to that idea of privatisation and large sections of the economy no longer being controlled, and that does seem to be the direction he wants to go in. Now the question is, how does he avoid going back into a situation where the private sector feels marginalised and basically doesn't want to get involved with the UK economy if they think that their investments could end up back in state and public hands.
I think Sarah Vine in the Mail on Sunday talks about a socialist coup. Is that where we're heading, Anne?
Yeah, well, not quite yet. Belarus conditions. But I think I noticed actually it's just interesting that the Mail group really not giving Andy Burnham, there's not a sense of let's give this a bit of a fair wind and see where it goes. But in fairness, as Andy pointed out, Andy, the one with us, Andy, the other Andy, Andy Burnham was also leaning into that by doing one of those 40 years of neoliberalism. I thought it sounded a bit like when you got your, radical student children home for the holidays, when you start talking like that over breakfast. And I thought that was, I'm not sure that I thought that was hugely his most sensible start, because of course it would get that response from people. You could say, well, they're on the right of politics, they're not going to agree about the balance of state control and private sector, the animal spirits. But at the same time, I think there will be some different kind of speeches coming from a new chancellor, etc. You also got economies are not, you can't wind back the clock 40 years. Economies are not the way that they were before the Big Bang in the city, before Thatcher, before the world was different. This is it's a bit like sitting there in 1920 saying, oh, let's have the conversation of 1879. So I think there is a problem with framing it in that way. What do you want to do then about the AI revolution? What do you want to do about the fact that you do need inward investment to drive growth in the UK? You can't do it all. I think there is a slight sense from Burnham, also from some people in his inner circle, that you kind of decide what your economic model is going to be and what you don't like, and then you drive it through. But actually, sometimes things like competitive advantage or opportunity are a bit about agility. They're a bit about making the UK the best place to invest because it's kind of a nice, stable country. It's on Greenwich Mean Time. These are like things that matter. You can't just sort of say, I'd like a different ism, and then drive it through in your first decisions. I think that's something he's going to have to adjust as he goes forward.
I mean, my feeling is that quite a lot of this is presentation that appeals to puts some of the things he wants to do, such as deal with the water problems, in a context which appeals to the Labour Party, and perhaps afterwards some of that rhetoric will go. Andy, what's your
I mean, I think there's certainly a very strong element of presentation, and being, as I say, in that room at the TUC, it went down extremely well, and those people there feel that's not what they've had under Keir Starmer. I think there is also a calculation about the cost of living and this idea that we've given away large elements that contributes to people's cost of living, whether it's energy or water bills or whatever it is, and there's some sort of sense of, if we can get control back over that, that's a way we can drive down the cost of living, and I think Burnham and his team think that will have a broader appeal way beyond the Labour Party.
Now, and I happen to know you're originally from the North East, but I probably would include you now in the Westminster bubble and the elite and all the rest of it. What do you make of Charlotte Ivers saying it's time for Southerners to unite and make a common front against all this Northernism?
Well, I'm going to be very conflicted, aren't I? There I am, as you say, denizen of Westminster for a lot of years, but coming from Northwest Durham, I mean, I think as always, she writes beautifully and is having a bit of a wind up there. But I think there is, as often the best kind of fun columns also poke a bit of a potential sore spot for a government. And I think Andy Burnham does have to be a bit careful with the Manchesterism and Makerfield. He keeps referring to this word Makerfield as if it was like Lenin to the Finland station. This is the model from which my great revolution is going to go forward. I mean, actually, if you come from my side of the Pennines, to the northeast, there's a bit of, well, what about usery here? Never mind the south. And I think that there will be a feeling that I think he's smart enough to perhaps sidestep this. That if this is seen as the north at the expense of the south, that would be a mistake, because still such a lot of our revenues and tax base is generated in the south of the country, and in the sort of golden triangle between London, Oxford and Cambridge as great centres, potentially even bigger centres of research, development, the economies of the future. So, but he is a devolutionist. He does believe, and I have some sympathy with this, that you don't always just have to take the model of Germany, which in many ways is limping at the moment, but it is nice to have a number of big cities where you know that you can be as successful and well seen if you build a business in Frankfurt or Hamburg or Munich as well as Berlin. And I think that is something that he's driving forward. But I think he has to be a bit careful that it doesn't come across as Charlotte was tilting at. It's like getting everyone in the south to feel chippy about the north. It's kind of funny because we're often discussed as being chippy northerners, and now it seems to be like the south might be getting a bit of a chip on its shoulder, at least according to Charlotte.
Are you for a southern fight back, Andy?
I think what Andy Burt, well, I am a southerner, you might not be surprised to hear. I think what he's got to now define better is it's not a north-south thing. It's a parts of the country that have been forgotten thing, and that can apply equally well to a coastal town in the south of England as it can to Makerfield in the northwest of England. I think that still doesn't get you round the sort of city, non-city argument, if you like, because that would still seem to me a difficulty for him to say, look, I'm not against London, but you can't really argue that that's a forgotten part of the country if your whole pitch has been, somewhere like Makerfield has been forgotten. But it's not about the north-south. It's about forgotten versus unforgotten.
Had to come up. Football, World Cup final, of course, today. The Mail reports about that remarkable third-place match yesterday. England 6, France 4. 3 Lions win the World Cup wooden spoon with bonkers but brilliant performance that might just vindicate Thomas Tuchel, of course, the German manager of England. Interesting hearing the German ambassador saying they were all backing the 3 Lions. Andy, what did you see the game last night?
I certainly did. And it was strange because when I started watching it, I thought, well, I'm sort of half interested in this. And by the end, I was, very quickly, I was completely gripped because England played very well, and it ended up being a fantastic game. And I realised I was invested because having gone 4-0 up, the idea that we could lose from there, I was distraught at the idea that we were going to lose it. So when we won, it was fantastic.
I did read that you went to the Times Literary Supplement party rather than watch the semi-final. So were you tuned in last night?
I do have a husband who edits it, so I thought probably I would focus on the marriage rather than the football.
Did you watch last night?
I'm afraid I didn't. In fact, we did get back, from the TLS party to see most of that rather tragic England game, and also I had to comment on it in Germany, and because I do a lot of work also writing about it for Bild Zeitung, the big, very football knowledgeable audience. I was somewhat terrified, but mainly I just had to talk about the Tuchel fallout. And it's so interesting that Andy just referred to it. Does this mean last week it did look, and there'd been obviously a bit of beef with Jude Bellingham as well. Was it going to be possible for Tuchel to save his reputation? He probably did a bit yesterday, don't we think? Andy watched it all, you probably watched it all, but that scoreline is extraordinary. Of course, it just reminds you of what might have been had it not been for that terrible scrappy back end of the game, which seamlessly took over from the Times Literary Supplement party is the most important thing going on.
Now, we do have a bar humbug blown very loud by Dominic Lawson in his column in the Sunday Times against the whole World Cup thing, saying corruption, cynicism and extortion 3, football 0 about this World Cup. Are you sympathetic to that scorn, Anne, or not?
It's a reality check, isn't it? Whenever you have these big sort of boondoggle events, I was certainly sympathetic to what lies behind Dominic Scholars reminding us of how corrupt the game and the management of the game in these championships can be behind the scenes. And the Sunday Times did historically that brilliant FIFA expose, which is still one of the corruption expose, which is still one of the great sports corruption stories, probably of all time. I think you do sometimes just need somebody, while the rest of us are eating our crisps on the sofa, to sort of point out what is going on behind the scenes, and I don't get the impression that things have got much better. So I enjoyed it. Sometimes you just need someone. I wouldn't say in Dominic's case this week it's just being so cheerful as keeps him going. but it's a serious topic. There's serious money and actually power at stake. So that's the job of journalists, isn't it?
I agree with pretty much all of that. I do want to put in one other great sporting moment that happened yesterday. I was at the London Olympic Stadium yesterday when Josh Kerr broke the mile record, which has stood for 27 years, running 3:42.66.
I've actually selected that.
Oh, have you? I'm sorry, I wasn't sure
if you were going to... It's on the front of the Telegraph.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, and I was there, and it was absolutely electric moment in the stadium. It's terrific.
And it's
You've
not
just
a world
upstaged
record, though, is
presented
it?
Yeah, it is. It's the world record.
It's a world
Yeah,
record and a UK record.
This has stood since for 77 years. This is Roger Bannister at Iffley Road in Oxford, and now it's another Brit, and it's a world record.
And it was a lot of seconds.
It was about
quicker.
half a second quicker than right, you got me now. You got me. I should have got on my story. 3:42.60. I think it was about a second faster than the one that had stood for 27 years.
Which is your daughter's an Olympic medalist last time round. Is she going for the next one?
Well, we got the Commonwealth Games coming in a couple of weeks, so she'll be there, running middle distance there. Georgia Hunter Bell, everybody.
Now, Anne, you mentioned Bild-Zeitung, part of the empire which Politico also belongs to. Interesting story about a senior, I guess we'd call him a minister probably, in our terms, who's had to resign over surrogacy and adopting a son. Explain this one.
Yeah, so this is Jens Spahn, who's a very prominent member of the Merz party, the Christian Democrats, very ambitious, very well known in Germany. He was sort of in like Wes Streeting in the days when Wes Streeting was a bit more up kind of character. He's gay. He wanted to have a child with his husband, and surrogacy is illegal in Germany. And I think if you think it seems that to have such a sort of ban on it seems quite bizarre, but if you think about it in the historical context of the idea, it's effectively renting out wombs for other people to have children, I think there's a bit of that squeamishness about the Nazi past there. So that, I think, is why it's been so, they have this very sort of binding prohibition on it in a Christian Democrat party with a quite strong Christian wing to it. He had also said in the past that he wouldn't support a change in the law. Of course, lots of people desperate to have babies want to change in that law. And then he's gone off and now used a surrogate with his partner, his husband, in America to have a child, and he's then thrown in his role, which is kind of head of the parliamentary party, but it's quite a strong organising role. You need to do well to keep in a coalition to keep things stable. So that's a bit of a moment on the front of the Sunday Times, which actually that's interesting to see an internal German politics story make the front page. It's also Spahn is a big, noisy character, also thought at one point to have chancellor ambitions of his own, but I think he's basically said now he's going to put his personal life, his family life, ahead of his political ambitions.
Bang to rights hypocrisy, Andy.
Andy seems to sound like it, but I am surprised that the law is a complete ban on surrogacy in Germany. I didn't know that. I think here the law is that you can't pay, but you can support with costs in terms of surrogacy, which obviously introduces a certain grey area, and some people are definitely unhappy about that as well.
Now, another international story in the Sunday Times. This is about the sacking of Defence Minister Fedorov last week by Zelensky in Ukraine. Sunday Times asking, is it his biggest mistake yet? And this does appear to be a kind of conflict between a young, progressive man in favour of drones and an old-style military commander.
Well, I mean, it's strange, isn't it? That on the one hand, we seem to think that we get the feeling that Ukraine is doing better on the battlefield, and now we seem to be having a sort of all this internal dissent and demonstrations and problems going on there. I mean, it doesn't mesh particularly. You'd think that there was a sort of united front going on when they're doing better, but at the same time there seems to be a lot of issues there.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I mean, I'm sort of surprised which side Zelensky's taken, if you like, but then he has at times felt that he needs to pull back a little bit on corruption investigations in order to keep the war machine going.
Yeah, I think there's that. I think there's something in the background of that. I don't think corruption is the absolute kind of first line reason for this, but there's always there who gets the blame for a lot of corruption around the armed forces. I mean, even about weaponry and massive amounts of material get leaking out of Ukraine. So sometimes even with the accusation, it ends up in Russian hands. So I think there's a blame game being played out there. The other thing that I think underlies it in Ukraine, as much as Fedorov was very much seen, as you say, as the modernizer of warfare, had some great results, there's probably some tensions there with the general that we're not privy to in detail about how much you can continue with that as a strategic play as well as something that has sort of stopped the Russian advance for what happens next. But the really recruiting and mobilization is a huge theme in Ukraine. It's not something the Zelensky administration want to talk about much publicly. When I tried to interview them about it, they always sort of seize up. Basically, they're not getting the people, the young men, to the front line and mobilise. They're kind of having to press gang them a bit into action. There's a lot of sense that the elites have a way of getting out of it. And that is a very bitter argument about who is to blame for that. So that seems also, I think these two characters just could not rub along together, and Zelensky was too afraid to get rid of the general at this point and thought that it was better to just heave out the defense secretary, as we would call it. That said, young people going onto the street in support of this man, which is kind of extraordinary. So I think that there is a fragility to the way that Zelensky runs his administration, and we're seeing it.
Okay, our time is against us, but just time for one prediction of a cabinet post, Andy.
Oh my God. Looks like Bernham moved for Chancellor.
And what about you, Anne? You got a prediction?
I was going to say, I think that's the one that's nailed on. Oh gosh. Okay, I'll give you I think Yvette Cooper here has cleared her diary, so I don't think she expects to still be Foreign Secretary. So which Miliband are we going to get?
Okay.
Perhaps something else. That's genuinely an interesting one, I think.